Okay, welcome. So today we're going to be hosting, Ward Laboratories is hosting a panel discussion on forage production and analysis. So we've invited a lot of experts here to speak to forage production, and then we also have David Macintosh here specifically to speak on the analysis portion of this. Just some housekeeping things. We would love to answer your questions, so please put your questions in the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A box as well down at the bottom of your screen for participants. So with that, we're just going to jump in. I'm going to do a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we will jump into answering some already received questions and any questions you guys put in the chat or in the Q&A. So our first panelist we have from South Dakota State University is Sarah Baurer. She's a forage specialist, and she's also director of the Northern Plains Forage Association, which is new the past 2 years, Sarah? So,
and then around about a year.
Yep, about a year. We've got Ben Beckman, and he is a forage specialist at UNL. He is also the co-director for the Nebraska Sustainable Ag and Research Education Program. He's been on our webinars before, so thanks again, Ben, for coming back on. We appreciate that. And then we've also got Mike Trammell out of Oklahoma State University as an agronomy specialist down there, formerly a Noble Research Institute plant breeder, and has also previously served here in Nebraska as a forage specialist. So he's got some ties here to our home state as well. And then we've got two special guests on our panel from University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And first we have Bruno Pederia and he is an associate professor, forage specialist, and the director of the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. And then we also have David Macintosh, and he is the program coordinator and researcher at the UT Beef and Forage Center. He is also highly involved with the Near Infrared Forage and Feed Testing Consortium, which we are members of course, Ward Laboratories. And they have the hub down there at University of Tennessee. He's also on the board for the National Forage Testing Association and is a part of the Council for Near Infrared Spectroscopy. So with that, we're just going to jump into some questions, and we're going to start with you, Mike. So just to kick off our webinar and give everybody some context to everything we're going to be talking about today, can you kind of tell us what forage quality means and why is that important?
Well, that's a question I get asked quite a bit. Been working with forages for 30 years, and seems like at least once a month I get that question by a producer. It's come in and they've got a forage quality test from a hay lot they're looking at buying, or maybe they've brought something in because somebody told them they should bring it in to their extension office and get it sent to the lab for testing. And kind of the simplified definition I'd go by is just, it's kind of a description of that forage's essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, energy contained in that package. And this is very important considering that for the majority of our domestic grazing livestock, forages is the major part of their diet. And, it's a measure of how this forage meets the day-to-day maintenance needs of that animal, but also of its that animal's performance over time, whether we're looking at putting on weight in pounds per day, maybe milk production, fiber if we're looking at wool. So it's very, very important. And there's not really another technique out there. I've had folks tell me they can look at color or they can feel the forage and tell you what the value of that is. But until you take a representative sample of that forage, whether it's from silage or from a lot of hay or from a pasture, and take it in to a qualified lab and actually get a test run on it, you're just really flying blind is the best way to put it. So, forage quality test is extremely important. It's the basis for a lot of our animal production activities.
Absolutely. And that impact on the animal is key. And so I think you did a great job summarizing that. So we're going to hop over to David. So one of the key parts and reasons why I wanted to put this webinar together is to, bring in the production and the analysis and help producers see how what we're doing in the field is showing on our reports. So what would you say, David, if you had to pick one single factor, is the biggest factor that can impact forage quality?
Well, I gave that a lot of thought, and if I think about it, when I look at all the calculated parameters that we use for energy, TDN, RFQ, RFV, I always go back to, well, it's actually two. It's ADF and NDF. So your fibers. Protein, it's there in your sample, but you can go pretty low in your protein as long as your fibers are okay. I think that's probably the most important characteristics I watch for when I scan samples. Having an agronomic background, I see the samples come in the lab, different times of the year. I know what species they are. I know, maybe they harvested it, last week or 2 weeks ago, or even last fall. And I see the ADF and NDF, and I can almost tell you, what the weather was doing, what kind of plants they were doing. Did they harvest late because of rain? And so that's probably the most limiting factor.
I think that's a great answer. And does anybody else on this panel have anything to add, or maybe they disagree, have a different parameter they would mention? No? Okay, so we'll ask then. So Bruno, when it comes to forage management in the field affecting the fibers, what are some of the key practices producers should be keeping in mind as they're out there in the field to ensure a quality forage harvest?
Well, that's a great question as well. I like to think about forage management in two ways, right? We can think about this pre-harvesting and post-harvest. In the pre-harvesting, it's when the forager is still in the field. I think we need to think about what we are doing in terms of frequency and intensity. How often am I harvesting the field, and how intense is that harvest? So those two things can help us to get a better quality forage overall. So be aware that the plants are growing there. And for example, this year in Tennessee was tough. In the last 2 weeks, we had a lot of farmers harvesting hay here, but they were all late, right? And we are not late because we want to be late. We were late because we got most of May under rain, and we couldn't have a 3-day window, 4-day window that we could harvest hay. So we all know that in terms of frequency, we were late in this year putting up hay. So if I can manage the weather, I will try to reach this frequency in order to get there when the plants are getting close to the bud stage. So I don't want to see that very, a lot of seed heads there. I don't want to see very mature plants. I want to try to harvest it when I have mainly leaves in that field, right? I think that will be my first goal, to be able to get the quality. But also when we harvest this, we don't want to go too close to the ground as well. And with the new equipment we have been accessing right now, because if you remember how we used to put up hay in the 70s and the 80s, we didn't have those sickle bar mowers that can scalp the field, right? So if we go too close to the ground as well, we may be able to bring dirt and soil within the hay, but also we are taking more than we should from our plants. So I will be affecting quality in both ways, because I'm not cutting the right frequency, and because I'm harvesting too short to the ground.
So actually that's perfect segue then into our next question. Sarah, a lot of producers maybe don't have the new, mowers or the best equipment in all areas, that we're servicing here as extension and consultants. So what do you say to hay producers that have limited access to equipment, and what are they using? What do you see them using and making the best of that?
I think it's a great question, because a lot of our smaller producers or beginning producers do have this problem and are trying to figure out ways to do their best and still put up good hay. And I think the age-old saying, putting up hay is a science and an art. it really is both. And if you talk to an older producer, they have sometimes all these crazy methods they use, but it works for them. So I never say that doesn't work. But if you're new or you just have small equipment, there are some things you can do to put up just as high quality of hay. It's just going to take longer sometimes, and you have to really pay attention. If you don't have those sensors and monitors, sometimes small investments can go a long ways. So one of the biggest things is making sure that your cutting timing is correct from the beginning, and making sure that we're cutting it and then checking moisture. So even if you have that sickle bar mower, like Bruno said, you got to try not to scalp the ground. That's really important, first of all, and leaving something there for our next cutting. Even if it's grass and you're cutting early in some parts of the country, that's important there too. And then, if you have the hay binder disc mower, you have the advantage of the crimping, and you don't have that with the sickle mower. So being patient is important. And sometimes raking, we want to rake as few times as we can so that we're not messing with that hay and spending that money and time, but paying attention to moisture and raking is important. So making sure we're checking that hay. I know we're at the end of weevil season for alfalfa in this part of the country. We're getting close to it anyway. So that can be a problem too. Sometimes they're feeding on our windrows and people get antsy and nervous. But that 15 to 18% is an age-old saying for most size bales. Some people go up to 20, depending on your baler and bale size. But if you're putting up a hardcore bale and you want it to last, especially without any preservative, that 15 to 18% is pretty important. And you can invest in some somewhat inexpensive hand equipment to check that if you're not comfortable with your own, whatever method it is, with your own hand method. You can get some probes, and there is equipment out there that's not horribly expensive to help with that. Some people will TED, probably more in Bruno's neck of the woods as we go east. We don't see a lot of TEDing here. And typically a small producer is not going to have one. That just speeds up drying, but we really have to be careful with them so we're not causing leaf loss. But there's a lot of these like basic management principles that can go into putting up good hay, even if you have an old baler and you can't put up net wrap hay. If we're putting up the hay, we want to make sure that we're looking at windrow width so that it's the width or just a little under the width of our pickup, or you can go half the width of your pickup. And that way, your baler operator can weave back and forth and not put up ridiculously shaped bales, right? Because putting up the nicely shouldered bale is important too. So that pickup width, you can adjust on most even old balers, and making sure that you're not digging in the ground with your tines. That's a big one too. The other things that we want to keep in mind are getting that hay off the field as quick as we can. That's an age-old thing. You're going to have to move the hay off the field, right? So getting that done and then storing it. I think honestly, in this neck of the woods where we have a lot of beef producers, they're not looking at quality as much as they're looking at tonnage. The biggest mistake people make is storage. So especially if you have twine wrap bales, your storage is really important. If you can't get it under a roof, think about some of the basic storage principles. So try not to put them in the shade. Put them in rows that run north to south so they get the sun exposure during the day from both sides. Keep 3 or 4 feet between the rows. There's kind of nobody seems to agree in the research world on whether the bales should be butted together on the flat end or leave a few inches between them. So there's plus and minus. If you're in an area that snows, that's where the space between them can be a problem. We get snow in between them, but they also dry out that way. So there's just a few of those things. You want them in a well-drained area, and we don't want to stack them or mushroom stack them where you got the soup can and then the round bale on top like people do for windbreaks. A lot of that is just not good for your overall quality. So honestly, those are all pretty basic principles. And even if you have old equipment or you're lacking some of those steps, you just have to be patient and really pay attention, and you can put up just as high quality of hay. It just might take a little more elbow grease and time.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, you brought up some really good points. With checking the moisture, I have recently had, several producers who have purchased those probes and then they're having issues with them. And so there's, lots of extension resources for how to, check with a microwave oven. Is that something, what does what do you guys as a panel kind of think on that? Because for sure, our lab turnaround time is not quick enough for what they need when they're in the field baling. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good point. And I should have brought that up. The $100 or $200 probes are not perfect. And the old Coster tester or the microwave method. And if you're not familiar with the Coster tester, it's basically a piece of equipment with a fan that runs a heating element. And you put the hay in a little basket and it runs hot air through it for however long, half an hour to 45 minutes usually, and it's dry. So you just need a wet weight and a dry weight. And so you can use the microwave too. You just don't want to do it in your house, especially if you're messing with silage. Your spouse or people that live with you will not love you forever if you do that. But basically, that's it's not extremely quick, but you can do it within an hour way to have a wet and a dry weight and know your moisture without taking it somewhere. But sometimes a local feed store or whoever your forage dealer is, sometimes they'll offer that service too.
Perfect. Okay, so we've kind of talked all about forage quality as far as the factors and the characteristics and production a little bit. But Ben, what do you say as far as choosing your forage? That's been a really hot topic with our, audience. We've had some webinars with Arrow Seed that have been very popular because of this. So what are your thoughts on what does forage species play a role in forage quality?
Yeah, I was thinking through this question, and it really comes down to knowing what your end goal is. So a lot of times we can really influence the quality of whatever feedstuff that we're wanting to put up, but we really need to know what we're trying to put up. So if we're, shooting for silage, then we can select the species for that's going to give us our best silage. If we're doing dry hay, if we're grazing it, knowing what that final goal is, and then knowing some of our management limitations is really important as well. We might be able to put something up, dry hay wise, that we've got really great regrowth potential. But if we don't have irrigation, access, and it's a dry summer and we don't get any regrowth, then that really doesn't do us any good. So knowing what that end goal is really important. So that way we can get something that's high quality. If we're looking at something that's silage wise, thicker stemmed, our forage sorghums, sorghum sedan hybrids, those sorts of things. If we're looking for dry hay, something that's going to be thinner that we can actually dry down and get into a bale in a decent amount of time. If we're looking at grazing, being aware of, prussic acid issues, nitrate issues, some of those sorts of things, having something that's going to have some regrowth potential, just keeping all those in mind as we go through the decision process is going to be really important. And then we can start fine tuning and making some, more pointed besides just basic, sorghum, sedan grass, teff grass, those sorts of things, start to really fine tune it and decide, okay, do I want to do a brown midrib variety? Is that worth the cost? Or am I just doing tonnage and it doesn't really matter if I've got that increased digestibility, some of the dwarf varieties. And there are a lot of, especially when we're looking at the sorghum side, there's a lot of new stuff that's been coming down the pipeline that I think we're really starting to understand how to use those better into systems and to really maximize what we're getting out of some of the options that we have available. But again, we got to figure out what we want, and then we can start to make all of those little decisions, even from an alfalfa standpoint, whether or not we want something that's, if we're just producing beef cow hay, we might not need the newest low lignin, alfalfa. We might go with something a little cheaper and be just fine with having a stand that's in there for 7 years and isn't going to have as high quality, but producing tonnage. So yeah, short or the long way around, make your decision with the end in mind. And that'll help give us a lot better idea of what forage species we want and how we can fine tune some of those systems to maximize quality and maximize what we get out of it.
Thanks, Ben. Yep, that's a great summary. So next we kind of want to go over here to Bruno. You've done a lot of work with weed control from what I understand. And so we wanted to ask you, weeds has been a huge issue for us out here in our alfalfa. I've had several producers coming in with mustard weed, and we're seeing it a lot too. So what are your thoughts on weed control in not only alfalfa, but, all of our forages? And, we also know that we can get, weeds provide they're a forage, right? It's just, we don't want them, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Weeds are interesting, right? And I'll let you start, with the concept. Weed is any kind of plant that we don't want to have there, right? A corn plant in a soybean field is going to be a weed. So that's what we want to avoid. We don't want to have a plant that does not help us in that single situation. In my overall take on the weeds is I like to have the system view of my pasture. If you understand what's going on with the whole farm, if you understand what's going on with that big field, it will help us to deal with weeds. It will bring us back to the very, I think the very answer I gave to you guys today. Again, frequency and intensity. How often am I harvesting? I am harvesting that field, and how much I've been removing. As Sarah mentioned that, how much we have been scalping the fields when we are putting up hay. A week or two ago, I visited one of my farmers here, and I couldn't hold myself. I got off the truck and said, "Man, you gotta see and get out and let's see this." And he didn't have more than an inch and a half there. It was like a few days after harvest, and I was wondering, if you don't have rain here for 3 or 4 weeks and you cut it at an inch and a half. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the potential of the fescue to regrowth and the potential of all of the weeds to show up and be there for the second harvest? So if I can have this long-term view and think about my system, I will harvest my fields at 3 or 4 inches, and I will leave some leaves behind. So the canopy will be growing faster, and we will be able to cover the soil. And my understanding is that the best herbicide I can have is shade, right? I will use all the chemicals when I need, but if I can shade my soil first, I'll do this. I'll keep my ground cover. I'll keep my fescue growing because I'm in the middle of the fescue belt here, right? I'm in the fescue heart of this country. So, and looking at the fescue fields as well, we need to remember that from now on, we are dry now. It's getting hot and fescue goes dormant. So we will see weeds coming anyway if I did a good job or not. So I will try to see it from the competition for resource standpoint. So what am I doing to allow my plants, fescue, alfalfa, as you mentioned, whatever is the forage you were working with, how much competition do we want to have there? Because the more I allow the weeds to come, higher will be the competition, lower will be the yield of the desirable forage, right? So I don't want to have this. It will also impact the forage quality because if I'm harvesting alfalfa with a bunch of other plants there, why I'm spending that money with alfalfa seeds and all of the requirement that comes with alfalfa if I'm allowing all of the other plants to come together? One of the trials that we have here in Knoxville is we are trying to get rid of glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranthus in an alfalfa field. That's a challenging. So we are trying to combine here, for example, boron with herbicides, and we are also testing a lot of herbicides that are not labeled yet to try to work with this because there is nothing killing our amaranthus right now. Mm-hmm. So it may also impact animal health because if you harvest with those plants that you don't want to have there, you are losing quality and your animals may not perform as you would like them to be performing when they are having there. And at the end of the day, economic impact because we are producing less, and especially if you were working with fertilizers, and at the end of the day, we are fertilizing weeds, not the forage, right? We are going right. Palmer or whatever you have there instead of be growing your alfalfa. So I like to see it with a very broad view. I don't like to kill, and I hate when people call me and say, Bruno, what do we use to kill this single weed? I don't want to kill a single weed. I want to understand why that weed is in the system. Is it intensity? Is it frequency? Is it lack of nutrients? Is it lack of what are you lacking? And then we can work with the system view to bring you back to a health pasture.
That's a great answer. And so we did get some questions before the webinar from some producers, and this was one of them. What is the economic viability of fertilizing hay fields? So you kind of touched on this in pastures for beef cattle. And so this was from a producer who basically just explained that they're having a hard time justifying the cost of the fertilizer. So what would you say to someone with that kind of outlook?
Sorry, I had my mic off. Well, I think he's right? It's hard to justify, right? Especially in the last 2 or 3 years where we saw that those prices skyrocketing. We were paying $1,000 for a ton of urea, for a ton of phosphorus and potassium. It was insane. What I like to see again is the system view, and I like to understand that we need to grow forage where we need forage. So soil test would be my first step. What do you need to apply? I still have been seeing people just apply because dad did like this, because grandpa did like this. And I know what it is. I'm the 5th generation of livestock farmer myself. So I grew up with my grandpa doing things that he thought was okay. And then I think when you have the soil test, you'll be able to offer to your plants exactly what you need. Right? And what we know from our data here, and David is part of this, in the last few years, we have been receiving some of the forage samples from Tennessee as well. And based on our results, we have been backwards with the calculation. And now we know that in a acre of fescue here that we have been harvesting, we have been removing, if you were producing around 2.5 tons in that acre of fescue, you have been removing 90 pounds of nitrogen, 24 of phosphorus, and 105 of potassium. So yeah, 90, 24, 105. We have been removing these per acre every time we remove 2.5 tons of fescue in our hay fields. So there is no way I can be a hay producer over a acre of pastures through 10, 15, 20 years without working with the fertilization. So what I would do, I would take soil samples, I will have yield goals for each of my fields and say, okay, and here I'm expecting 2 tons, here I'm expecting 5 tons. And based on this, you can work on the viability of this, applying exactly what the plants need to reach that single goal.
That is a great answer. Of course, we're very big proponents of exactly what you just talked about. So we have a question on this in the chat. What is the best way to fertilize to minimize compaction and soil disturbance? So anyone can answer that. Doesn't have to be Bruno.
Looks like a lot of questions are going to hit Bruno.
Well, I can try this. I think every time when we were talking about minimizing compaction, I would like to understand a little bit more about this, but the first thing that comes to my mind is phosphorus, right? Phosphorus is the one that brings energy to the plants, will bring to us a really good root systems, and will help us to have more tillers. So I would like to see this broadcast, and especially with phosphorus and potassium to bring to the plants more than nitrogen, because that's another thing. I think that's another common mistake I have been seeing here. We are all pretty much okay with 60 pounds of nitrogen, 100 pounds of nitrogen. Everybody will be talking about this, and I know that in some states in the US, phosphorus is not an issue. And first time I was working in Kansas, I heard about, there is no potassium problems here. And then I started to take soil samples, and I found a lot of places that potassium was the one lacking there, not phosphorus. Now in Tennessee, we have some places where phosphorus is the issue, some places that potassium is the issue. So putting those things together will help us to create this soil health environment.
Perfect, thank you. And so then this is Terry from Ward Labs, wants to know, what sampling depth do you recommend for soil test?
Yeah, we recommended about 6 inches on our soil testing for our lab. That catches quite a bit of the nutrients in the root zone at first 6 inches. Now we do have situations we may want to do some deeper sampling. especially on some high throughput operations or something that we're looking at some subsoil mineral content or some other things there, or high fertility conditions, we may be looking at some different things below that 6-inch depth. I think the main thing that I see with soil sampling is taking a representative sample. Get too many samples that were somebody probably just drove out into the middle of the field, got out, took one sample, put it in the bag, and calling that as a representative, soil sample of the field. Same thing can be said for sampling or forage as well. It's very, very important to get a representative sample. That way we can get the best value possible to try to represent what we're trying to put some numbers to.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer, Mike. And I'm going to kind of switch gears because you had submitted a question you're getting a lot from producers. I've gotten this question as well, and it kind of touches back to what Sarah was talking about earlier about storage. So because of, if you have a year where you have a lot of great production and rainfall and you have a lot of hay, stored in your barns and your sheds, what have you, what's the best, what should be fed first? The oldest, the newest, what should we be feeding first?
So storing hay outside is very common in the area of Oklahoma I work. We got a few producers with pretty nice hay sheds, but a lot of it's stored outside. And I store some hay outside myself as a producer. And the one thing I'm really concerned about is dry matter loss over time. We're in hot, humid conditions. We can get a lot of moisture in 2 or 3 inches in a rainfall, going on for several days. But hay stored outside, some of our research here at Oklahoma State shows that within 9 months, we can lose anywhere from 5 to 20% dry matter off the outside of that bale, depending on that bale density, the condition of that hay when it was rolled up. If we start looking at hay that's set outside for 12 months or longer, we could, be up in 30% more dry matter loss. And you don't, I think some folks don't really think about that. If we put up 80 tons of hay, we've got that stacked outside. Maybe we've got 30% dry matter loss. You've already lost 25 tons of hay from that standpoint. And if you're on a forage budget and you're really calculating what those animals need tonnage wise, maybe you needed that 80 tons. You're going to have to go find 24 tons now somewhere, either grow it or go buy it to replace that. So if I'm storing hay outside, I'm going to try to feed that hay up as quickly as possible, just to minimize that dry matter loss, not as well as the forage quality as well.
So I've had producers actually kind of inherit an old hay shed and not really know how long that's been in there. What would kind of your recommendations be for them in those scenarios?
So I like to, if I've got some hay that's been outside for a while, or even if it's been under storage, I may had a hay test on it that was a year old. I'm going to test it again. I need to know where it's at. Maybe I had hay to start with that I did not need to supplement. Maybe I was feeding some dry cows and that hay was sufficient. Maybe I've got some dry matter loss and nutrient loss now that I will have to supplement those dry cows in order to meet their maintenance needs. So it's very important to test that hay each year, and to test it by lots as well to make sure that what's going on with that hay over time. And the condition of that hay when it's put up is extremely important. Just to go back to on some points Sarah was talking about, I had a producer tell me a long time ago about putting up hay. It's always important to remember that baleage equipment is not cultivation equipment. We do see a lot of stuff cut pretty low and a lot of hay that's raked where the mulch and sticks and everything else is rolled up into that hay as well. So it's very, very important to roll up a quality product when we're out there working.
That's brings us actually backwards to something that Bruno touched on, Sarah touched on. So I didn't know if maybe you or Ben had some thoughts on this. And I know, David, you probably do too, but soil contamination, that can be a big deal for impacting the animal. Do you have any Ben, do you have any thoughts? You're nodding your head on or not compaction, excuse me, contamination in the bales. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's just something that we need to be aware of. It can be rough on, the animals if we get, especially, in our neck of the woods where we're pulling, cornstalk bales and stuff sometimes. And if we have a lot of, dirt into that diet, that can just physically be rough on the animal. And then when you think about it from an economic standpoint, you're paying for dirt. There's some weight that comes along with that, and it might not seem like much when you look at a forage sample, but you start adding that up and we're lowering the quality of what we're feeding. We're having, some negative impacts on our animal, and we're paying for something essentially that we don't need. And so, anytime that we can try to keep things as clean as possible, and let alone wear and tear on, the equipment that we're using for feeding, and putting, it's a lot of times rougher on the equipment as we're putting that up too. So anytime we can keep, things clean and keep as much, contamination out of, especially, like I said, corn stalks where we see it a lot of times, or if, folks are raking a little bit too low, on a field, it's just, we want to keep that out if we can.
Yes, absolutely. So along those same lines, we have a question in the chat. Is it absolutely necessary to rake before baling?
I think anyone could probably touch on this one, but my opinion is no. Probably depends on the part of the country you're in, because in some areas probably isn't much of a choice to get it dried down. Here where Ben and I are, depending on the weather in this kind of middle northern part of the country, if you're leaving a reasonable amount of stubble, typically you get enough air up under there. If you don't have the time, the manpower, whatever, you can usually get away with it. But raking, there's like the plus and the minus if you have that option, because if you rake, you're disturbing the hay. But on the other hand, you are going to leave it sit there longer, and so it's going to take longer to dry, and of course longer to bale if you're not combining windrows. So I have had this question, put up a lot of hay on our own, and I would say it's not always raked, because sometimes it dries quick and you just get going if you don't have that person to rake. But if you get into a more humid climate, there probably isn't much of an option. Depends on where you're at. And you guys can fuck my answer if you want.
I would say in our neck of the woods here, if you don't do, we may be in trouble, especially because we don't have long windows, right? We always have rain in the forecast. So you want to speed up the process and be able to make hay as soon as possible and get them ready. Otherwise, you may get another inch of rain in 3 days.
We're just sitting over here praying it rains someday.
Yes.
But getting that hay off the field, that's a good point, Bruno. If it takes too long to dry, you're hurting yourself. So it just depends on where you're at and the weather.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and circle back to the forage quality and the NIR report, or the report analysis of it. And I'm specifically going to speak to NIR. What I kind of meant with the ash, if you have too much ash contamination, that can cause an issue with, scanning on the NIR. And whenever we see issues with scanning on the NIR from a producer perspective, we immediately see a lot of skepticism. So David, what are some things that you would specifically address that skepticism? I think there's less of it when it comes to alfalfa, but I see it a lot in, grasses, people thinking we need individual species or sometimes even specific geographies of different calibrations. But of course, that's not how the consortium works at all. And we tout that those are the most robust equations. So what would you say to just the skeptics on that?
Well, I was just sitting here compiling some data I've got to have for a talk tomorrow. So I did a poll with 4 of the largest labs in the country. And I probably should do a shout out if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have Wood Laboratories, Dairyland Laboratories, Rock River, and Kern-Lunbery. What shocked me is one of the labs is reporting 76.8% of all their samples coming through their lab as NIR. The rest of them are all above 85% to 90% NIR analysis on everything from corn silage to feeds to forages. So I think that age-old question is starting to go away. I've noticed in the last 12 years since I've been doing NIR that people are getting better at scanning. People are trusting the results coming from the lab a lot better because of certification programs, the way the producers have learned how to take samples better. And it really helps. A dirty sample coming to the lab, whether it's wet chemistry or NIR, is almost impossible to analyze because it creates, within near-infrared spectroscopy, it uses a light bulb of some type to go through the sample. Well, guess what? It hits a piece of dirt. It reflects, moves around, and if there's moisture involved, the sensor's getting the data back, it's all messed up. And we can see it in the spectra. And sometimes we can see it on the grass. I'll even say, you remember all the fires in Oregon and out west the last few years. Even their forage analysis on those samples coming in, the smoke and the ash from the air getting in those samples, you can see it in the spectra. That's how sensitive NIR is. What NIR does is uses the wet chemistry values of a forage that's similar to what is being put through the instrument. It gives you data points back that makes an association to wet chemistry. That's how you get your results. So I think the skepticism is getting better. I know that publishing, I know that projects, almost all the projects that I know of are using NIR to analyze their samples now. It's too cost prohibitive to do the wet chemistry.
Absolutely. So I know you mentioned before we got on that you maybe wanted to share your screen here when we got to this question. And this is a question that I receive a lot. We're under a lot of scrutiny when it comes to our calculated values, the RFB, RFQ, TDN, even the net energy values. So what values would you say producers should be looking at? What is a useful calculated value? And what is going into those values that you think that they should know? And this is something I'm posing to David because I know he has a lot of background in this. But after he kind of shares, if you guys have some more commentary on this, since you're all forage specialists who have looked at reports, we'd love to hear.
Can you give me sharing capabilities?
Oh, sorry. Yep.
That's
Let me see. How do I do that?
So everyone watching, I accused Rebecca of a loaded question on this. And I think all the forage specialists will agree. But I'm hoping everyone's sitting down for when I do share my screen, because what I'm about to show you, when I first started working with Lisa Baxter on this a couple of years ago, we literally had to just stop and breathe when we saw how many times, just looking up one constituent, how many formulas are out there that give you the data that you're getting on forage reports across all labs in our country.
You should be able to share.
Okay. How does it look?
Yep, we can see it. Perfect.
Okay. Is it showing a bar across the top? I can't see it.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, but you can see it.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm not going to touch on anything other than TDN because this right here is probably the one energy factor that everyone's used to. Everyone's pretty consistent across the United States using it. Now, what you see in the slide is that bale there, we tested it. We sent a sample to the University of Georgia, your friend Utam, Becca.
Yep.
And we also tested it in the Tennessee Forage Lab. Both labs use different TDN calculations. The one on the top gives you a lower TDN, has lots of other factors in it, digestibility of NDF over 48 hours. So that limits you to a 48-hour period with your TDN. So, but if you go down to what we do at Tennessee, which we had a whole committee meeting about this, it took quite a few hours, and we ended up using the ADF method for TDN. What that does is it affects that ADF is more related to your protein and your lignin in your sample. So we went with with that TDN level at the bottom, 63%. But you can see it. The same forage sample went to Georgia and it went to Tennessee, and how the TDN came back. Now, this is where I want everyone to be sitting down. I can get the slide to go. Let's see. There we go. So Lisa and I had a contest, see how many different calculations we could find on. She was assigned RFV and I was assigned TDN at the same time. And I think Dennis Hancock had RFQ, but we had 30 minutes and to do a search and find as many as we could that were different. And this is what I found for TDN. I found 20 in the literature, which is, peer-reviewed journals. I found 10 commercial labs, 8 extension pubs, 2 NRC books, and 4 research labs had all of these different ones reported, some different ones on the same report. What I found out here is no one knew where TDN actually originated. If you go back in the literature, decades, back to the 30s, 40s, you cannot find out who actually invented TDN. If someone knows, please email me. I would love to know, and so would a lot of other people. So what we found is that one group would use the next group's finding. If they want to adjust it, they'd adjust it. And then they go back to the original that they found. Then they go back with someone else's. A lot of times they use a big lab in Canada's TDNs. So it's gotten more confusing over the years of really what's right. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but this is a big shock when we saw this. I hope that answered a little bit of that question.
Yes, and I would just add, so then when we look at our net energies, those are all calculated based on the TDN. So what I see is a lot of downstream. Why is my net energy of gain so low? And we can just apply a different equation and change that completely. So that's almost scary.
Yeah.
So did anyone else have any commentary kind of on this topic? So if not, then we can go ahead and we'll just go through our panelists here and do some final thoughts. We don't have any more questions in the chat. Unless, David, I saw you answered one. Did you want to answer that live on here, or did you want to email them? Oh, you're muted.
Would you like to read that question aloud, and then I'll...
Perfect. Okay. In alfalfa production, what influence does significant drought stress between cuttings have on ADF and NDF development? I frequently see lower RFVs even though I'm cutting at very late bloom, showing I'm flood irrigating and can't get the water across the field fast enough, so my crop experiences significant drought stress between cuttings.
Okay. My first thought was referred to looking at your lignin value. The next would be look at your NDF and ADF. See if that lignin value is increasing, even though your ADF and NDF are not. That means it is under drought stress. It means maybe it's evaporating too quickly for the plants to get it. The next thing is with the RFV calculation, all labs probably default to a percent of body weight they put into that calculation. At Tennessee, we use 1.2. I'm not sure what other labs use on this one, but it's a default dry matter intake or percent body weight that's put into the RFV calculation. I would probably we go on the higher side on this, percent body weight, but I'm not even sure on this. I'm glad that question came up because I'm now curious how people are adjusting that. It's probably very regional. Becca, do you know what you guys use?
I think it's 1.28.
Okay.
And I think that came from University of Wisconsin's, Dan Undersinger's publications.
Yeah. And I think ours came from the NRC booklet at some point. Probably from the 1,200-pound cow scenario.
Yours is probably more accurate to beef than ours, I would say. Interesting. That is a good thought. Okay, so we've got another. Oh no, that's an old one. Sorry. Okay, perfect. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I was just gonna go through each of our panelists and see what your final thoughts are. We'll go ahead and start with you, Sarah.
Sure. I think we've covered a lot of good stuff. And that last bit about how many equations you found is actually kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm scared. But I think those were great questions, Becca. And to most of, I guess, what I talked about, there's a lot of science and a lot of art to putting up hay, and a lot of it, no matter how big you are or how much help you have or how new or great of equipment you have in technology, it goes back to the basics, like really paying attention to how we're cutting, when we're rolling it up, how we do that, and how we store it. I always really hard on storage because we do all this work to put it up. Oh, hopefully we're doing that well. And then if it's around here, especially if it's got to sit outside and you don't have a tarp or a roof, you really want to make sure you're paying attention to how it's stored. So that would be my number one.
Absolutely. Ben, do you want to go next? Wrap up your final thoughts.
Geez, Sarah kind of took a lot of my thunder there. A lot of it just does go down to knowing what we have to work with and tweaking those little things here and there that we have available to us. There's a lot of options, a lot of, fancy things that we can throw into the mix, but just looking at the systems that we have, knowing where we want to end up with something, and then seeing what we can do to tweak those goals. From a production side, we can move, quality quite a bit just using what we have and doing some management things.
Bruno, we'll go ahead and go to you next for your final thoughts.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. I think it was great. We got good discussion here. One of the things I have been working on this topic that we didn't mention today is the importance of testing the hay, right? Regardless, if you produce it, if you bought it. I've been discussing a lot of, and here in Tennessee, we have really small operations that most of our farmers, you will be buying hay. So my thing is, even if you bought that hay, why you are not testing it, right? You are just feeding the animals without knowing what you are feeding. So in order to get good calculation and what do I need to do to reach my animal's requirement, how much it's going to cost to me, and even to decide how much I'm going to pay for the hay, right? Even if the seller don't want to test it, try to test it before you buy. And if you already bought it, okay, test anyway. Maybe next year you don't want to buy from them again, right? So I think there is a ton of value in a forage test report that will help you to make a lot in your economic decision. So please test the hay if you're producing or if you are buying.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll go to you, Mike. And I asked David about the NIRS, and you obviously you used to be on the consortium board. You probably have some thoughts on that. So I was wondering if you had some more thoughts on that, and then any closing final thoughts as well.
Yeah, from an NIR standpoint, I think it's great, especially looking at fibers. Not all fibers the same. So I think it's great looking at, if you're really fine tuning rations, looking at NDFD at 48 hours, different things, learning how to use that information. I think NIR is great from that, and quick turnaround as well. It's kind of like going back to what Bruno said. You don't know what you don't know, and a hay test, a forage quality test is cheap information to get, and it's hard to make decisions if you don't have that information. So in a perfect world down where I'm at, if I could get producers where they could graze 365 days a year, that would be perfect. But we'll probably never get away from hay completely. But if they're going to have to buy hay or put up hay, then I really stress putting up quality hay. So.
Absolutely. So David, do you want to wrap us up here?
Sure. So don't let what I showed you scare you. Just know that every forage lab out there that I work with and that all these people work with that you see right here, they all stress out to be certified, to make sure we're delivering a good product to you. People behind the scenes with these near-infrared spectrometers are stressing out and doing their best to give you the best calculations and calibrations to predict what you're getting. And if you looked at the last 20 years and the last 12 years that I've been involved, it's gotten so much better and you can trust it. And I just want you to know, don't let the TDM thing scare you away from getting your forage tested. Just know you're welcome to use your own calculations on your side as well to test what the calculations from the lab are giving you.
All right. Thank you so much, David. And thank you for all of you guys for participating. You guys shared so much great information, and I even learned a lot today. So I did forget to mention at the top of this that this webinar is available for one continuing ed credit for American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. So if you guys need that, go and log that after you've watched this webinar. Other than that, thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to our attendees for listening and submitting their questions. And with that, have a great National Forage Week.